The Jungle Tide by John Still. Where the Elephants Die. The eagles who soar in the mountain air have seen where the elephants die, and know where their vast bones lie. Yes, they know, but they do not care for a treasure of ivory. Monkeys who peer through the tangled brush avoid the dim place of death, where the moonflower weaves her wreath. They stare, but they break not the hush, as their little ones hold their breath. The wind that rides over the tossing trees pipes high in his sorrowful tone, but he pipes for himself alone. For he tells not a soul what he sees as he sweeps by the place with a moan. The rocks that encompass the elephant's tomb believe that their place is best. Their shade by the dying is blessed, while they guard that dim hollow of doom and share with the dead their rest. O elephants, wandering far o'er the plain, or trumpeting high in the hills, you may drink from the tumbling rills, but you turn to the mountain again to seek for the valley of pain. Chapter 3. True Foresters. There is a man, I once was told, who, if he would but bestir himself, could write the best book ever written on the diseases of pineapples. There are many men who could write a better jungle book than has ever been written, if only they could write at all. But I do not expect they will ever set out to do so until they have lost the knowledge that now is theirs. They and their tribe are called gypsies by the English, because they still live the wandering life gypsies try to live in game-preserving England. But the Sinhalese call them Ahikuntakayo, the snake charmers, for they are notable tamers of wild creatures and are the folk who sometimes come into hotel courtyards to charm cobras or make monkeys dance before visitors. They call themselves Kurava, and what that means I know no more than the meaning of my own name. I fancy they can all speak Tamil, and many of them Sinhalese too. But the tongue they speak among themselves is Telugu, or some dialect of it, and I believe they still consider South India their mother country. Though all I have asked claim to have lived their whole lives in the Ceylon forests. There were Telugu dynasties in Lanka in the Middle Ages, and these folk may have come over in the wake of the invading armies. But they have little concern with courts, for they are true foresters, and like the deer and the mongooses, the leopard and bear cubs, the cobras and pythons and monkeys they catch and tame, are part of the natural fauna of the woods. By the authorities, they are regarded as a criminal tribe, possibly with justice, although I had many dealings with their members at one time and found no evidence of uncommon wickedness. Perhaps, like another of the nomad tribes of India, they may have cast a rule forbidding the commission of a crime within a certain distance, about 30 miles, I believe, of their camp. It is a wise rule, And if we and the other great powers could agree to some adaptation of it, armaments might be reduced at once, and the acting of historical plays to be filmed become the principal function of the army. Kurava do not settle in villages or live in houses, but travel about the jungles with a few pack animals to carry their scanty belongings and build their huts anew at each new home. I had known these strange people as purveyors of entertainment for some years before chance first led me to make friends with one of them in the jungle. It was in the month of May, and before either railways or motors had carried their blessings into the northern plains of Ceylon, that a friend drove me in his pony trap along a grass road through the forest some 20 miles south of the buried city where I earned my living by watching Tamil coolies dig up Buddhist monasteries their faraway ancestors had looted. My host was inspecting an irrigation work that has since caused thousands of acres of wild forest to disappear, some of it beneath the waters of a tank, in whose shallower bays the drowned trees still stand, gaunt and bleached white, ghosts of kings they were when first I knew them. Some of it went up in smoke and flames, slaying its multiform population, and has now grown to a dull uniformity of linear miles of aloes, the appearance of Manila ropes whose grey spiked regiments stand to attention on the earth that nature refuses to leave bare. This was his work, and I, less harmfully, hoped to shoot a few wild fowl, or if very fortunate, a deer. I did shoot a few birds, and got a shock from it. While I was standing on the bund of a little village tank, bathed in an afterglow that set the sky afire, two whistling teal came flighting over me, and I dropped them into deep water a score of yards from the bund. A slim boy, brown and naked, slipped in to retrieve them for me, and the ripples of his swimming made harlequin patterns of blue and gold and scarlet, where the mirror of the sky rocked in his wake. As he put his hand on one of the birds, a crocodile's black jaws broke through the colors and engulfed the other. That had been the day before, and now we were fulfilling an appointment to meet a Sinhalese man who had promised to guide us to the dam built by devils, an exact translation of our Devil's Dyke, a ruined stone weir designed by some king of 1,000 years before to turn the waters of a river into thirsty fields now lost. Dam, fields, channel, houses, and even their names in the forest that has covered up that ancient kingdom. The guide met us by the roadside near the camp of some black, rough-haired, untidy-looking people, very lean and ill-clothed, who all stared with animal wildness and human impudence combined, while one man stood expectantly behind our Sinhalese. They were Kurava. There were half a dozen bivouacs built of branches and talipot palm leaves, so light that a donkey could carry enough to house a family. The entrances looked like the arched mouths of caves, less high than the heads of their owners or my shoulders, and sloping away to nothing at the back. They seemed rather the dens of hunting animals than houses as we think of them, but I suppose every Kuravan there had been born in one like these, and all their forefathers as far back as we like to imagine, for the Kuravan has no history. Happy is the nation that has no history, it has been said, and I think the Kurava are happy when the authorities do not harry them too much. They had no possessions at all, it seemed, except the clothes they wore, a few zigzag silver bangles on the women's arms, Plenty of silent, watchful dogs of the kind we call pariahs, rarely a very ancient breed whose points are depicted on some of the inscribed pillars recording royal grants of land as long ago as the days of King Arthur. The grants end with a protective curse, like that sometimes written in schoolboys' books. May he who destroys this be reborn as a crow and a dog. And the dog whose picture follows is very like the hunting dogs of the jungle. The Kurava had a few cooking pots, several donkeys, a couple of fawns, and their flat snake baskets. But this was wealth, if wealth be that which satisfies desire. If a rich man may be defined as one who is able to get all he wants, so too is the man rich who wants nothing he cannot get. I fancy that a Kuravan's real wealth consists of dogs, snakes, and women. Dogs supply food, for they hunt everything there is, from the swift and wary sambar to the eggs of lizards. And it is claimed that the fine hunting dogs of the Kurava sometimes tree leopards and bay them until their masters can spear them. Snakes do not supply food so directly, though the Kurava are reputed to eat non-poisonous kinds and do not deny it. But they keep the Kurava in clothes, for theirs is what officials term a money crop. Something you do not eat but sell, so that you may buy knives, miniatures, and the like imported goods. The Kuravan does not often sell his snakes, for the market is easily glutted, but the sport they provide brings him the small income in cash he needs for the purchase of arak for himself or ornaments for his women folk. So snakes and dogs are indispensable. And as for women, their uses are obvious. They cook the lizard eggs and mend his clothes and make the snake stones. I do not think the Kurava wash their clothes, but if they do, of course, that would be another use for women. In a country where the morals of certain castes, not more despised than the Kurava, have been compared with those of the chicken run, it is worthy of mention that Kurava women keep to their own kind. English gypsies are said to eat hedgehogs, and their forest prototypes certainly eat porcupines, whose flesh, though too scented for my taste, is not at all bad. Turning to the expectant man, our English-speaking Sinhalese, who acted as my friend's interpreter, said that he wished to charm snakes before us, and we gave leave for this to be done. He told us further that the cobra the man would display had only been caught on the previous day. The charming took place on the ground beside the trap we sat in, and was the usual performance. The Kuravan poured the snake out of the flat circular basket, whose shape as surely denotes a snake as a kennel does a dog. And after a prod or two, the cobra sat up, displayed his hood, and made passes at the man who dodged them. Then the charmer took between the finger and thumb of his right hand a little piece of the root of a plant I only know the Tamil name for, Vele Eruk Lay, and holding this towards the snake, very slowly approached it nearer and nearer while the creature struck, or seemed to strike, at his hand. I noticed that he approached the head from above at a slope of about 60 degrees and never stopped or hastened the slow downward and forward movement until in time his little bit of root reached the top of the cobra's head. Then, with his hand, he pushed its head down until the snake lay prone, when his fingers closed round its neck. His other hand took up its coils a few feet nearer the tail, and he slipped it back into the basket and put the lid on. We had both seen all this before, but the man deserved a rupee, and we paid it, and were about to pass on when the man remarked to the Sinhalese that no white man could charm a snake. The Sinhalese himself, of course, would have almost died sooner than have touched it. But he smiled. Up to then, I had not spoken except in English. But I said at once that I would do with the snake what the charmer had done, and got down from the trap to make good my boast. For it was only a boast, and I had never touched a live snake in my life. The Kuravan opened his basket, poured out the snake, prodded it, and handed me the bit of root, and I copied very carefully what I had seen him do, with precisely the same result. The only time the man intervened was when the snake lay flat on the earth, and I was about to grasp it. "Hold very firmly," he said, and I did so. Afterwards, when I got to know him, he told me the only difficult moment in seizing a cobra is when its hood is still partially expanded, for it may suddenly let this collapse and so loosen one's hand hold. This was the beginning of a friendship. Before all his people, he pretended to make me free of his guild. Mockingly, I feared, for these things are not done so lightly, and yet I felt proud, and indeed he treated me afterwards as a friend and not as a mere fount of rupees. He rolled back my sleeve and tied 3 threads in succession round my upper arm, a red one, a black, and a white, and recited the while a sort of ritual naming me, my household, and my animals for protection in language that recalled to me the words of the 10th commandment. He also presented me with a snake stone and promised to visit me some day in Anuradhapura. When the Kuravan redeemed his promise and came to see me, he brought a cobra as a present. He said it was a female, and I took his word for it and called the cryptogamous creature Mary. In the East, one sometimes avoids the vulgarity of commerce by an exchange of gifts, and I gave an old coat to the man who gave me Mary. He handed me, too, a supply of pills to be taken when snakes bit me, red, brown, and as big as peas. They looked like earth, and I never took one, and eventually lost them. But I wish now they had been analyzed. Only when one lives 70 miles from the railway station these things are not so easy to do. I have talked snaked by the hour with that Kuravan, and learned a great deal that was true as well as much that was otherwise. He did not believe that snakes cannot hear, and relied upon his pipe to keep them interested. I used to whistle myself, but one of the 2 greatest authorities on tropical snakes assures me that all snakes are completely deaf, even if a kerosene oil tin be banged above their head. Mary lived for a long time and grew quite tame, but I was a fool, and I lost her through my folly. To cure my servant of unreasonable fear of her, I kept Mary on my dining table throughout a meal while he served it, and occasionally I asked her to sit up. Mary did not mind at all, but the next time I had to be away for a night, she escaped and never returned to me. I doubt if he actually killed her. More likely he just pushed the pane of glass off her box and let her go. Or she may even have done it herself. Quite early in our acquaintance, the Kuravan told me that the cobra I first handled had its fangs drawn, and that all the cobras his people handled had suffered the same mutilation. About 5 months, he said, was as long as they cared to leave them without defanging anew. As for the public, if anyone demanded to see the fangs, all that was necessary was to catch one of the ordinary teeth in a loop of thread and show that. And they never knew the difference. I was surprised that men whose mastery of their art was so complete should require to take this precaution, but what if I were drunk? He asked me. Mary's fangs grew again. I think for one day a rat I had given her put up a fight, flew at Mary like a bulldog, bit the edge of her hood, and cowed her into concealing her head in her own coils and pretending to be an ostrich. The victor sat up like a kangaroo in the corner of the box and grinned his defiance, and I was about to release him in admiration for his pluck when he fell over and died. Two young Englishmen came to see the ruined city while Mary was still with me, and in the evening I asked them to my bungalow. Mary lived in a box in the veranda, and her only difficult feminine point was that she hated to be touched while still in her box. So I always used to allow her to walk out before I took her in my hands. She was just coming out nicely when the lamp blew out. We could hear Mary puffing softly like a kettle beginning to boil, but we could not see her, and I did not care to feel for her. The two visitors fled into the garden, but they were brave enough to stay there and throw boxes of matches at my voice until one hit me and I was able to light the lamp. Many years after this, I gained a sidelight on what must at that time have been my reputation among my less scientific neighbors. I had long given up snake charming, but I heard it said in Sinhalese of another Briton who did so. He has drunk so much electricity that snakebite cannot harm him, and if he were to marry, it would kill the woman. Not long before the time I write of, a dweller in the hills had written to the newspapers a long account of a charming of snakes that had taken place near his bungalow. Correspondence ensued, and eventually a little booklet was published, and I obtained a copy. But to my hatefully agnostic mind, the story presented several problems and held elements of doubt. So I consulted my Kuravan. He knew the story well. It was one of the successors of his tribe, so I came to know the two halves of truth, which, like the two halves of an apple, fitted when placed together, though they were different, the one being complementary to the other. The rosier half was this, though to the Kuravan it seemed the greener, and it was the one that was printed. A charmer came to the door and asked to be allowed to catch some of the snakes which he said abounded near the bungalow, although its occupant might not have noticed any. Permission was granted, and they set out together, the charmer and the investigator, and not in the direction chosen by the charmer. The Kuravan piped like the Pied Piper, and soon drew a cobra forth from the covert by the music of his magic flute. But as he put out his hand to take hold of it, the snake bit him in the thumb, so that two jets of blood appeared where the fangs had pierced. All this the writer of the pamphlet saw at close quarters, and vouched for personally. The Kuravan grew faint, but applied a snake stone that clave to the punctures until all the poison was drawn, and went his way, leaving behind him the magic stone, which was retained in the interests of science. My Kuravan's half, never before printed, was different in several particulars. According to him, the charmer hid several snakes in various places so that he could make sure of passing one of them, whichever way the chase developed. Then he took a long thorn and pricked his thumb twice near the root of the nail so deeply that it bled freely, after which he licked the blood off and went to the bungalow. Up to the moment when he was struck by the cobra, the two halves of truth run parallel. But the charmer was not really bitten. When he made as though to seize the cobra, he provoked it to strike and dodged its blow as a thing he did every day of his life. But he gave a cry, "I am bitten!" and seizing his wounded hand in the other, swiftly milked his thumb as though it were the udder of a cow, thus causing blood to spring from the thorn pricks. With the concrete evidence of his wound to his credit, the rest was easy, and my friend added wistfully that his cousin sold the snake stone for 10 rupees and a bottle of whiskey. Had he been really struck, I can only predict with certainty one thing he would have done. He would have preserved the life of the snake most carefully, for these men believe that snakes have power to undo the evil they have done, and he would have spent his last cunning in trying to win the pity of the snake so that it might suck back the poison it had injected. I have never made snake stones, but I know the recipe. Take a portion of sambar antler and char in red ashes until well calcined. Bury the product in black mud for 12 months, then dig it up again, wash it, break it into pieces of suitable size and polish each of them with a stone. Finally, dish up with sauce and get what you can for them. But the men do actually believe there are genuine snake stones to be found in the bed of a certain river in India, though I have not met a Kuravan who claims to have possessed one. Charmers do not train snakes to do tricks, though there is no doubt that these creatures, like all others I have had, except 3 only, soon react to kind treatment and grow accustomed to be handled by some particular person in some particular way, though they remain conservative and impatient of innovation. The ordinary performance of a charmer, like my first lesson I have described, is based upon the ordinary reactions of the cobra. It cannot be done to snakes who do not raise their bodies off the ground to sit up, so to say, and no charmer I have known would touch a Russell's viper in the same light-hearted way, if at all. I found one imprisoned in a dry well once, an ancient well whose closely fitting stone slabs offered no crevices for climbing, so the snake lived there on frogs that were foolish enough to hop in. Like most ancient wells, this one had a projecting stone here and there, left on alternate sides as footsteps. So I climbed down and captured the viper with a noose. I kept it for a long time but never handled it, nor could I persuade any Kuravan to do so, though they offered to defang it and then tame it. I suspected that cobras found it difficult to strike so as to hit an object brought slowly down at the proper angle. The Kurava all said it was the root that prevented them, but I suspected otherwise, and at length proved my theory. My Kuravan never touched his snakes without having a bit of the root on his person, and sometimes he offered it to the snake to smell before commencing operations. Otherwise, he generally had a bit tucked under the bend of his knee while he squatted. Nevertheless, I suspected magic and determined to test the root's efficacy. Mary was docile and aided my experiment. First of all, I fashioned a bit of wood to resemble my magic root, tried it on Mary, and found she did not know the difference. Then I substituted an ordinary bit of matchstick for the facsimile, and again Mary paid the same respect as always. So, after that, I boldly used the tip of my finger and found it every bit as formidable. But of course, Mary was a friendly snake, and although her docility had convinced me, it was not yet good enough evidence for others. So I awaited a favorable opportunity to carry the research further. It soon came. I was moving flower pots in my veranda, and a wild cobra came out from among them on the cement floor where I had him at a disadvantage, for the floor was slippery, and he only made ineffective "sss" of himself instead of gathering speed. My ophiological curiosity, in English damned folly, came uppermost, and I tried on him the ordinary technique of the charmers, but without the root. So successfully that in a minute or two I had the cobra safely bottled in alcohol, which in those days, it may be of historical interest to record, was still obtainable by the poor. I have pondered over this matter, and have wondered whether the snake's eyes focused upon a point above the level of their normal vision, which is brought steadily nearer and nearer until they are obliged to squint, may suffer from strain, with that consequent partial paralysis of the optic nerve the earlier hypnotists sought to induce in their subjects by revolving mirrors and similar devices. I am not claiming to be more than a lay wanderer, and offer this suggestion very humbly. A phenomenon which appears superficially parallel is the so called hypnotizing of a hen, who is laid on the ground with a line drawn from her beak, and who remains still for several minutes. It occurs to me, however, that I have never tried whether the hen would stay there without the line being drawn at all. Nor have I tried merely putting my hand on the head of a strange cobra without going through the charmer's formalities of approach. And now I must wait until my children leave school before it can be done. Among all the wild animals I have kept, the three exceptions who refused to react to kind treatment were one crocodile and two leopards. The crocodile was the only one I ever had, and was precisely 11 inches long when he came into my hands, fresh from the egg. But out of the mouth of that babe proceeded a concentrated hatred of the universe that never abated. He never learned to love or even to tolerate me, hissed when I approached, snapped when I fed him, and after 6 months of constant care and unrequited affection that almost broke my heart, hissed, struggled, and bit when I set him free by night into a neighbor's pond. For it was too distasteful to emulate Mrs. Bond and kill the creature one had already robbed of its freedom. At different times I kept 7 leopards, never more than 2 at a time, and of these 5 were friendly and 2 were untouchable, from the day they came to me until the day some months later, when I fashioned a crate with a trapdoor, lured them in, and packed them off to Hagenbeck, wondering to whom it would fall to let them out again. They were a brother and sister, so probably some strains among leopards are fiercer than others. My first pair, Hero and Leander, were the most lovable wild animals I ever knew. They would jump on my shoulders and kiss my ears, and it was their privilege to lap a little milk on the table while I had my tea. Boxing and wrestling with one another, they used to protrude the tips of their claws enough to be felt, but not enough to hurt. But when playing with me, an inferior, soft-skinned creature, though friendly, they kept them safely sheathed in the beautiful pads that give them their silence and sureness of foot. Among many games, their favorite was to pretend I was a deer. They would make an elaborate stalk from bush to bush, and from stone to stone, acting apparently in concert, until, at the end, they would rush me and pretend to grasp my legs. Or perhaps they would dash past, striking and barely missing, and then suddenly and immediately calm down and stand indifferently, gazing into the far distance as though they had second sight. They did not hunt at all except in fun, though they were free for hours every day and night, and could have found at least numbers of lizards and tortoises to catch if they had wanted to. But they did take possession of things belonging to me and refused to give them up. Such articles as a boot or a cap they might annex, and it always meant a tussle before I could recover it, for they obviously believed in private ownership like all other wild creatures and like all children from a few months old onwards. And yet, there are people who preach communism as though all nature did not deny it. At that time, I had 2 bears and a jackal, too, who was a mean spirited beast right up to his tribal reputation. But of the bears, one, Rurik, was a fine character, and the other, Billy, perfectly good natured. All the 5 animals were in charge of a small boy, and every day they used to follow him for a walk as free and as tame as 5 terriers. I lived in a holy city that was mostly underground and covered with forest. It was a place of pilgrimage to Buddhists, and one day it happened that a number of pilgrims were visiting a ruined dagaba not far from my house at the same time that the animals were out for their constitutional. Like the majority of pilgrims, these came from far villages in the more populous part of Ceylon, where bears are as rare as in England. They kneeled upon the pavement before the dagaba, heads on the stone and tails about a foot higher, and worshipped the relic, and the scented blossoms they carried to lay upon the altar were by some of them placed for the moment upon the stones before them. All around them, the scrub and high weeds were only cleared once a year, and to these civilized villagers it seemed a jungle. In this matter, Rurik confirmed their judgment, for he walked along in front of the kneeling row and ate of the blossoms he found there. When the pilgrims yelled, Rurik barked, for he was not wanting in spirit. Although tame, he was not accustomed to canter behind my bicycle. And when the boy heard the sounds of battle, he hastened to the voices, and the other animals thought it a game in which they were expected to run. So they hastened too. Of course, they outstripped the boy and got there first. So the pilgrims saw the call for help uttered by their first foe, answered by Hero and Leander and Billy and the jackal, and they turned and fled wildly. The boy reached me in a state between fear and laughter, and the villagers must have made a tale worthy to rival that of the boys who jeered Elisha. Rurik had but one joke, but he played it upon many people. In the mornings, when he lived in the veranda, tethered to a post by a long chain, it was his pleasure to loop the chain round and round the barrel of his body and strain against it as though he could not get another inch forward. When strangers came near to admire him, he pulled on his chain until he judged them to be within striking distance, and then whipped up his hind legs, shook off the loops, and swiftly plunged forward the few feet thus gained. If he could, he clasped the stranger's legs in his stout curved arms, but he never really hurt anyone. Bears and leopards differ much in character. I brought Rurik up from tiny babyhood and fed him with the corner of my handkerchief dipped in milk before he could well walk, but he always went for me if I came upon him suddenly round a corner. As he touched me, he realized who it was and stopped, but his first instinct was to make attack his surest defense. On the other hand, if I surprised one of the leopards, it would sum up the situation in one lightning glance and remain perfectly cool. Palpably, its intelligence was far quicker than the bear's, as hunting animals should be. When Rurik was found, newly born, in the hole his poor mother crawled into to die of gunshot after she had attacked some of my coolies who came clearing jungle too close to the nursery she had chosen, he was brought to me. He could not walk then, and if I put him down he would cry bitterly to be taken up again. So I know definitely he had received no outer education, not usually an easy thing to assert of forest-born animals. Following on that, there were months of drought, and then one day it rained heavily, and the earth, which had been as iron, grew soft and sweet-scented. Rurik went into the garden and straightway dug into a termite's nest, a castellated hillock that had been of cement-like hardness ever since he could remember. With his long claws he bored into the main gallery, made a little hole, and then placed his rubbery and airtight mouth upon it and sucked out termites exactly as wild bears do in the forest. On a smaller scale, the curious noise of his suction was precisely that made by a full-grown bear I had watched at this after being guided to the place by his sound from some distance off. This is recorded as it seems to be an unusually complete instance of a skilled action being performed perfectly by a large animal at the very first attempt. As a contrast, a baby otter I had when newborn and brought up in the same way as Rurik could not or would not swim until I had thrown him into the water many times. He would stay on the other side of a stream I used to step across and weep and whistle till I threw him in again, when he would clamber out at once. But after a week or more, he loved water better than land. Only once did one of my foresters hurt me. A very tame young leopard brought up in a village hut where I had bought him for 6 rupees that morning. When I got back, I released him in a dining room with lights on, and I think the newness of everything frightened him, for he bit through my thumb and held on. I talked to him gently and did not pull, and presently he let go and made friends. But I still carry a small scar. Deer, monkeys, cats of many tribes, an armor plated pangolin, and a host of other foresters must be passed over, but not the lorises. At night, when the light of the campfire flickers on the leaves, and far sounds come filtering through the treetops, the thin and ghostly cry of the loris is often heard. But though he is widely distributed and is not an uncommon beast, I have only once seen one at large, and that was in my own garden not many days after I had set free a she loris because she ate her baby. I felt that captivity was too much for her and had better be ended. But I have heard the voices of scores of them, for they are very small and live in the treetops, and they move very little until it grows dark enough for them to see, by which time it is too dark for them to be seen. Their figures resemble ours even more than monkeys do, for they have no tail, and on all but one of their fingers have delicate little nails like a baby's. The other has a claw. The Sinhalese of the forest recognize the likeness, and a not uncommon nickname for a very thin person is Unhapulua or loris. They creep slowly about rather in the way that chameleons do, but they can shoot out their long thin arms with startling rapidity. I have kept many lorises, for jungle men can usually find them, and they make gentle, attractive pets. Only to keep them well, they ought to have insect food, and that is tiresome to procure. One of mine lived for several months as a sort of Simon Stylites marooned upon a pair of antlers that hung in my dining room. He could not climb up the bare wall, and he did not dare to risk the jump down. But I used to lift him off and place him on the table at meal times. The Sinhalese say that the loris, who weighs less than a rat, can kill the roosting peacock by flinging its long arms round his neck and biting to the brain. I doubt the truth of this, but doubt my doubts as well, and have some lingering suspicion it may be true, for I have seen one stalk and kill a sleeping sparrow in the manner described, so surely and easily that he must have been used to hunting birds. For the most part, mine lived upon insects, but they would hunt geckos for themselves, and one I had came to a tragic end hunting in my veranda while I watched him. He pursued a tarantula who could easily have avoided him, but did not seem to care to. The tarantula escaped, but not until he had bitten my loris in the hand, after which nothing seemed to help him, and within a few hours he died of cramp or paralysis. When my wild animals fell ill, I used but one medicine to cure them, and the value of that was psychic rather than physical, for I used to drug them with laudanum milk and warm water as much as I dared or could get them to take, reasoning that as they all had perfect health to start with and clean ancestry, though being wild, they chafed more and were more rebellious against fate than domestic animals. If I could give them peace of mind, they were likely to throw off any disease not necessarily fatal, and it generally worked. A story of one of my lorises became known to some in Ceylon a generation ago. There was a very great lady, now gone to her rest, an extremely able woman, and much of a naturalist. All governors' wives were great ladies, but this one was head and shoulders above the average, and the only blemish she had was a somewhat prominent moustache. She was a great friend of mine, and I gave her a loris. Some time afterwards, it happened that the director of the museum and I were both guests at a fairly large dinner party at Queen's house. He sat near the great lady, and I at the far end among small fry like assistant ADCs. When the great lady spoke, all other mouths were closed, and she chose to speak of lorises. The museum man, who was an FRS, was learned on deep sea organisms but weak on lorises, and she sent her voice all the way down the long table to ask about mine. So the whole company listened while I told how one of mine used to sit upon the table and catch the moths that flew against the lampshade, and how he had sometimes climbed upon my shoulder and grabbed my moustache in mistake for a moth. Complete silence reigned, while the great lady said very solemnly, "Mine never got as tame as that." I think she meant it as a joke. These dinner parties bored her excessively, and I think she wanted to see the faces of the people she did not like as they tried to look as if they had not heard. Like most nocturnal creatures, the lorises' wonderfully large and beautiful eyes, and fiends who make quack medicine sometimes tie the poor little things close to a hot fire so that those eyes may weep, and their tears be bottled and applied to the cure of an ailment which only people who would practice such an abominable act deserve to suffer from. With the freedom I was able to give them, and in their natural climate, my animals were as happy as beasts may be who have lost their birthright. Rurik used to follow at my heels and often accompanied me to my work among the ruins, where he would rummage about like a dog. Neptune, the otter, lived completely free always in my garden that had a stream running through it, and sometimes he went off for the whole day. The leopards used to have at least one good walk every day, free and unfettered, and the pangolin was accustomed to follow me to a termite's nest, where I would leave him free to burrow as he liked for half an hour at a time. Isabel, a pythoness, came back twice after she had been given her freedom, and in the end I had to take her out into the jungle, put her head into a hole, push her tail after it, and run so that she might lose her way and be compelled to accept the boon I offered her. But even thus, I do not doubt that they would all have been happier if they had never known man. For, like retired colonels, they suffered from having no work to do. Sometimes it seems as though too much of our lives were devoted to the endless business of preparing meals and washing up after them. But it must not be forgotten that nearly the whole time of wild animals is spent in similar fashion. Even the buffalo, who eats that common commodity, grass, has to spend a great deal of his time finding and consuming enough of it. And the flesh eaters must often go tired and hungry to bed after hunting all day. So, wild creatures have little leisure in which to grow weary of life, whereas the zoo seems to me a sad place, where we make beasts share with us the burthens civilization lays upon so many. It is partly their own fault, perhaps, for allowing one species to dominate all others, but it is sad, and I feel that if means could be devised to persuade all the animals we keep captive to earn their own livings, they would be all the happier for it and would probably live longer. The ends of foresters are generally tragic, and Hero's death was particularly so. She had been used to the freedom of my one-storied bungalow, and I took her to stay in a large house where my bedroom was on the first floor with a balcony outside it. A towel was hung to dry on the balcony rail, and Hero made a toy of it, and I did not check her. But in an evil moment, the towel slid down from the rail as she tugged at it, and Hero, who had thought it made fast, fell down upon a cement floor below and broke her back. I kept her for a day, and she licked my hand like a dog as I tended her. Then I carried her into the garden and stood back to shoot her. But she crawled towards me with her hind legs, failing to ask me to help her, and tears were in my eyes when I put her out of her pain. These animals, and the men who caught them for me, were true forest children, the men little more able than the animals to write a history of their doings, and they would all be patient of my ignorance if they could know what I have made of writing it in their stead.